Hey, welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about distributed energy resources interconnection. We did a training for fellows last year on this topic, and this year we have some additional information based on the work that we have done since then. Our presenters today are Kathryn Chelminski and Grace Relf. Please enter your questions and comments at any time in the chat box, or you can raise your hand during Q&A to answer a question live. We'll call on you to unmute yourself, and you can ask your questions in the middle of the presentations. You can wait till the end of both, but we appreciate any comments and questions you have. And I'll put a link to the presentation slides in the chat box in just a moment. So Grace is a former member of the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission. She was the chief of policy and research there and has a lot of experience in DER interconnection. Kathryn Chelminski is our other presenter. She's got a strong background in energy savings performance contracting, DER interconnection, and a host of other topics. And so they will be our presenters. And then just to remind you that we have a couple additional trainings coming up. On February 3rd, this is a new training on transmission basics by Frederick Carl in Berkeley Lab affiliate. And then on the 24th of February, we have a training by Pete Cappers on rate design. And there's more to come. So we'll be announcing that shortly. All right, Kathryn. Kathryn, we can't hear you. All right, well,
Apologies, my Zoom restarted. Can you hear me?
we can now, yes.
Okay, apologies for that. Let me just share my screen. All right, is that coming through?
Looks good.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Kathryn Chelminski here. Thanks all for joining. Today, I'll be talking about DER interconnection and the overview of process, data, and queue management. So we've been talking about first the I2X DER interconnection initiative, the importance of improved DER interconnection data. I'll provide an overview of the interconnection process, data limitations and gaps. We'll share some insights from Berkeley Lab's work on US DER interconnection data and outline some actions to improve data timelines and queues. So turning first to the DOE's Interconnection Innovation Exchange Initiative, the I2X initiative provides strategic roadmaps such as the DER interconnection roadmap, which we'll be talking a little bit about today, provides forums for stakeholder engagement such as I2X Connect, data and analytics, as well as research and innovation. The DOE's I2X DER interconnection roadmap is a guide to support actions that can be taken in the near term that will implement solutions to address current DER interconnection challenges. So if you're interested to read the roadmap, you can scan this QR code here and learn more. And also this link below, you can join the I2X Connect, which is a stakeholder platform to encourage discussion and exchange on DER interconnection, among other issues. The DER interconnection roadmap outlines four main solutions and goals. identified here. The first is to increase data access and transparency, as well as security for interconnection. Second goal is improving interconnection process and timelines. The third goal is promoting economic efficiency and interconnection. And the fourth is maintaining a reliable, resilient, and secure grid. So we'll be talking a little bit about these goals and solutions today. Within the I2XDR roadmap, there are a set of success targets that are being measured with the aim to provide solutions that will help the community achieve these goals by 2030. The goals include shorter DER timelines, looking at reducing the median timeline for DER interconnection from the application to the agreement, increasing access, so higher DER interconnection completion rates. The third goal is better availability of interconnection data across the country, reducing bulk power system disturbance events exacerbated by inaccurate DER modeling. And lastly, lowering CAIDI, or the Customer Average Interruption Duration Index. So we will be launching a couple of polls throughout this webinar. The first poll is, and this will pop up in your screen, so if you can fill this in, which interconnection topics are your organization working on? Check all that apply. Faster timelines, higher application completion rates, better data provision, great to see responses on that, more advanced studies, improved reliability. I'll give you all a couple of moments to fill that in, and then we can share the results. All right, so we have improved reliability leading, better data provision responses. Let's give it a couple more seconds and then we can end the poll. All right. Thank you to all that have responded to the poll. So we have 67% replied that improved reliability is a major area of work. Second is better data provision. Third is higher application completion rates, and tie for more advanced studies and faster timelines. Thanks all that participated. All right, moving on. The importance of improved DER interconnection data. So what is interconnection and why is it important? Interconnection is the result of a process of adding distributed energy resources to the distribution system. This term can refer to the technical, procedural, and legal requirements of the interconnection process or the interface between DER and the utility distribution system at the physical location at which the DER asset provides certain electrical and interoperability capabilities. Interconnection allows utility customers and third-party service providers to connect solar projects, natural gas generators, energy storage, and other generating systems at customer premises and operate them in parallel to the utility system. In addition to providing services to meet their own electricity needs, customers can use interconnected DER assets to sell power or ancillary services to the utility at the distribution or bulk power system, for example, through a DER aggregator. The deployment of DERs, such as natural gas generators or solar PV, have grown exponentially in the US over the last 15 years. As you can see in this figure to the right, LBNL tracks project level data on distributed solar and storage systems over time. So between 2000 and 2024, you can really see a tremendous growth in installed projects. Between 2010 and 2023, the number of residential PV systems, for instance, grew from 89,000 to 4.7 million systems. So as DER deployment has grown, so have interconnection queues, timelines, and all of this stressing interconnection processes for distribution systems. Interconnection data are vital to DER deployment. There's different types of data that are both provided by customers and third-party developers, as well as by the utility. So the information that's collected by utilities and provided by customers includes rated power, stored energy, technology and system type, location of the project, some of the data that is provided by utilities to developers or customers to support siting and estimated costs and timelines includes projected upgrade costs, timelines, dates for instance, when an application is submitted, when an interconnection service agreement or an ISA is executed, dates of system impact study, et cetera, as well as a queue position, status of a project, et cetera. This data is crucial for measuring performance over time and identifying areas for improvement. And so we just want to draw the difference between interconnection data that measures performance and grid data that informs interconnection. So former includes data such as queue volumes, processing timelines, interconnection costs paid by a customer, and data that is for the grid to inform interconnection includes data on grid constraints, locational net benefits, available hosting capacity that could be used for forecasting upgrade costs, and cost ranges for upgrades. Moving on to the interconnection process. So this figure represents a simplified interconnection process, and it kind of breaks down all the steps. So if I have a project, I submit an interconnection application through my utility. Once that application is approved, I'm assigned a queue position. The project may move through technical screenings or studies depending on the size, and a couple of other factors. Then in the best scenario, you receive an interconnection agreement, you pay any cost, move forward to design, procurement, and construction. Then the project is eventually commissioned and in service. But in reality, this process can be much more complex, especially across different markets. So this is an example of a process flowchart from New York of their standardized interconnection requirements, the quote unquote simplified process for solar projects. So as you can see, and while the script is very small, there are many different points throughout this process that are kind of stop and go and provide information between a customer and a utility. So even within an application process, for instance, once you submit an application, if there's missing information, the utility may send that back to the customer or the developer and ask for more information, or then the customer has to send it back or decide not to submit. And there are many go, no-go points throughout this process. All of this can lead to some delays throughout the timeline. So turning to data limitations and gaps, data on distributed generation queues are not widely available and are not necessarily representative of queue backlogs across the country. So the figure to the right shows some of the data that Berkeley Lab has collected to date on publicly available DER interconnection queues. As you can see, it is not representative of all 50 states. So it's just important to acknowledge that some of the states is just based on what data is publicly available. So data sharing practices vary significantly across the US. The type and frequency of data sharing are not standardized, aside from requirements for adoption and compliance with IEEE 1547 standards. Publicly available data are based on state requirements for data sharing and standardization. So while queues in some states may look larger than others, it may be due to available data rather than indicative of high levels of DER deployment. However, in states that have really high standards and requirements for data sharing, every utility will post their queues publicly, and so therefore the queues that you see in this image may be representative then of accurately depicting all installed or interconnection projects in the queue. Some of the major barriers to data sharing and data collection include utility labor and resources needed to collect, aggregate, clean, and standardize the data. May be due to computing requirements for data collection and data sharing. And lastly, concerns over privacy and security of data. Technology complexity adds challenges to standardization. Different types of DER technologies have distinctive characteristics that require specificity in interconnection rules, since the capabilities of that technology and the grid impacts of that technology may vary. So for instance, there are many different kinds of solar PV and different size systems. You have small residential systems, less than 25 kW, that will behave and have different grid impacts than a larger commercial or community solar system between 1 to 5 megawatts. The same goes for projects that are behind the meter, located on site behind a customer's meter, versus virtual or remote net metering systems or community solar systems, which are located off site, for instance, on a landfill, and they're not behind a meter on a customer's premises. There's also battery storage systems that could be standalone or hybrid, DC coupled, AC coupled, as shown in this image to the right. Microgrids or hybrid technologies include more than one technology that are share a common interconnection. And then other systems like natural gas generators that all behave differently and have different capabilities and different grid impacts. So this can certainly add complexity into standardizing interconnection rules. The market complexity adds further challenges to interconnection standardization. The maturity of the DER industry in each jurisdiction varies. This can all affect the complexity of interconnection requirements, the volume of DER applications in a queue, and the utility workforce needed to meet the needs of the queues. So market size, market saturation, and any incentive programs can impact the pace of interconnection applications in a utility territory. So for instance, if a new solar incentive is announced, there may be a rush of developers or customers to submit applications into the queue, leading to a spike in queue volume. Each state and utility have different standards for data sharing, including the type and cadence of data that's shared. These standards vary across states, but they can also vary within a state, differing across investor-owned utilities versus rural electric cooperatives and municipal utilities. So public utility commissions, or PUCs, oversee the interconnection regulations and standards for investor-owned utilities, but not necessarily for munis and co-ops. NARUC published a chart in 2021 that indicates that there are 31 states where PUCs have limited authority or oversight over other utilities in the state, such as munis and co-ops. But in most of those states, this authority does not necessarily extend to interconnection. Overall, the pace of reforms needed to mitigate interconnection challenges can vary depending on the market, regulations in the state, and resource availability. So coming to the second poll, we wanted to ask what the biggest interconnection challenges are in your state. You can check all that apply. This includes large queues, timeline delays, upgrade costs, projects that are sitting in the queue, which is sometimes referred to as zombie projects. So a project that's not where the developer is not intending to continue with it, but hasn't formally withdrawn the project from the queue. And then, of course, if there's other issues in your state, please feel free to enter those into the chat and we can read that off. So I'll give a couple of seconds for folks to respond. Thanks to those that have replied so far. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So we see a pretty close tie between timeline delays, upgrade costs, and projects sitting in the queue. So thank you to all that have replied to this poll. All right, moving on, we will dig into insights on US interconnection data. So Berkeley Lab has been funded and supported by DOE's I2X initiative to collect data on DER interconnection. We're building both a dashboard and a report that analyzes the data available on DER interconnection across the country. So this is a map that indicates our progress so far on collecting publicly available data. So the states in yellow represent states where Q data is available for one or more utilities, but not necessarily for all the metrics that we're looking for, or all utilities in the state. The states with the crossed lines are representative of states that have limited Q data available, and anything in gray is representative of states that either don't have publicly available data or it hasn't been collected yet. And so you can really see that there is variability in publicly available data across the country. The I2X, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab DER Interconnection Dashboard, will harness data collected from across the country on queues, timelines, and costs for all types of distributed generation and storage connected to utility distribution systems. And so we'll go over some examples from this dashboard in the coming slides. This interactive tool will allow users to build custom queries, apply filters, aggregate metrics, and visualize results in multiple formats. Users can also download visualizations and associated aggregated data. And so the intended audience for this tool will include utilities, regulators, policymakers, developers, DER customers, and other stakeholders that will then be interested to access the data for benchmarking and examining progress on DER interconnection performance metrics over time. So one of the views will be to be able to understand of the projects that are sitting in interconnection queues, what percentage are connected and operating, what percentage are on hold, what percentage are under study. And so of this data that's been collected so far, we see that the majority of projects are in service or operating. That's at 86.5%. And 4.9, nearly 5% are finalizing, so soon to be interconnected. We're also collecting data on average timelines by state. So this figure shows over time, each bar is a different state. What are the average timelines in months of an application or of a project from application to in-service date? How many months does it take for me to get to operation if I submit an application in New York versus Vermont? And what does that look like over time? And as you can see, it looks like the timelines are coming down over the period studied for the states available. We're also looking at the snapshot of particular states. So what are average timelines in New York? We have the ability to zoom in to look at separately different system sizes. So what is the average timeline for a small project versus a large project? All the way on the left is 100 kW. So more residential type systems versus large commercial C&I type systems all the way on the right. And you can see that average timelines increase as system size goes up. We're looking as well at average costs. So this is on a dollar per kilowatt basis. What is the average cost to interconnect a system over time? This is a view from 2010 through 2024. We can also look at the average cost of an upgrade by state as well as by system size. So this figure shows buckets of each state, but breakdowns by system size from residential up through larger systems. And this view shows average distribution system upgrade costs for projects that are specifically 100 to 500 kW. What is the average cost for each state? So a lot of interesting views and will allow users to be able to zoom in on particular metrics that they want to study. So turning to some of the actions to improve DER interconnection queues, timelines, and data sharing. We'll go over some regulatory mechanisms and some technical mechanisms today. So starting with regulatory mechanisms, data sharing and transparency requirements is a major mechanism that will improve data availability on DER interconnection data. And so we'll go over a couple additional slides after this one. Timeline enforcement mechanisms require study timelines and put in place penalties for utilities failing to meet them, which are intended to improve accountability. So kind of the stick and the carrot stick approach. There is an example of this approach being used in Massachusetts. The DPU established a mechanism that measured timelines and required utilities to report aggregated performance data. Non-compliance resulted in penalties paid to project owners commensurate with financial impact of the delay. An alternative but similar mechanism is a performance incentive mechanism, or a PIM, that can be tied to a specific metric, such as an improved interconnection timeline and or planning process. For more examples of PIMs, NARUC provides a resource in a working group that you can click on this link to find more resources and examples. Some approaches to managing high volume queues include establishing fast track or expedited review processes for small systems, enabling the use of group study and or parallel study as opposed to serial study, which we'll go over in a moment, which can help aid in managing high volume queues and increasing efficiency. And the last mechanism is the creation of an ombudsperson role, which acts as a dispute resolution mechanism, then this role can help reduce interconnection challenges and mediate disputes between DER applicants and utilities. And another option is establishing informal working groups that can improve alignment among stakeholders. So digging in a little deeper into data sharing, some of the considerations for data sharing include clarifying data required from utilities, from utility customers, and project developers. As I mentioned earlier, the performance data and the data that's collected from customers is different than the data that a utility may provide to customers, and all of which are very important. Protecting sensitive data, balancing utility costs and workloads with the granularity and frequency of updates for queues, timelines, and hosting capacity, developing accessible and secure data sharing platforms. Public reporting sites are very useful for interconnection data that support transparency, so I'll provide an example of that in a moment. And lastly, facilitating stakeholder groups that can support regulators and utilities by sharing their data needs and providing use cases, as well as providing feedback on utility data sharing. So here's an example from New York's Con Edison utility of DER interconnection data. So this is a snapshot of a queue of individual projects, where they're located, the timeline, dates of when they applied versus when they were under study, and when they went into construction. On the bottom left is also a snapshot of a hosting capacity map, showing kind of green available feeders versus red constrained feeders. New York State provides a consolidated interconnection information platform on a public web page that has all of this data consolidated in one place that's easy to access. The page links to standards and utility-specific interconnection requirements, hosting capacity maps, queue data, and other resources. So this is a great example of a platform that can assist with publicly available data. Turning to technical mechanisms for expedited review, three ideas and concepts that have been applied in other states include the use of pre-application, fast track, and supplemental review. So pre-application process is where a utility provides customers with basic information for a reasonable fee about their proposed point of interconnection before they submit a full interconnection application. So it provides a little bit more information of whether a point is a go, no go for interconnecting a system. Fast track is where utilities expedite review processes for small generators that have a low risk of triggering adverse system impacts. And so this is a more refined approach based on locational factors that allows smaller systems to more quickly move through the queue, as opposed to a serial approach where whoever applies first is in the queue first. And even if you have a small system with low system impacts, you would follow wherever you are in the queue. This fast track system would allow projects to skip the queue because they have lower impacts on the overall grid. Supplemental review is if a project fails a fast track screen, an application can go through a supplemental review to determine whether the DER asset can interconnect without a full study. And this is in practice in states like Ohio, Massachusetts, Illinois, Iowa, and California, and some other states are considering adopting this approach. Another technical mechanism is known as parallel study. I referred to this a little bit earlier. So historically, utilities have studied DER applications serially, so in the order of application receipt. But this practice can slow down interconnection queues and create backlogs that are exacerbated by increasing DER deployment. Parallel study, in contrast, allows for two or more projects to be studied at the same time. Some approaches of this can be referred to as a group study or a cluster study, where a utility can analyze projects together. One definition is a group study evaluates projects that are electrically related and can interconnect to the distribution system safely. And then the utility identifies any grid upgrades that are needed to accommodate these projects. And then projects within a group study typically share study and upgrade costs. And so there's a list of states that have pursued this approach. That being said, serial study, as we said, can create backlogs, but group studies and cluster studies are much more technically accurate and are designed to alleviate queues. But there are some delays and challenges to adopting a group study approach, whereby if one project withdraws from the queue, it could affect the study results and cost sharing across the projects, where projects then within the group may need to be restudied. So this is something that needs to be fully thought through in the adoption of these approaches. So lastly, some examples that regulators, state agencies, and other stakeholders and utilities can consider. So some recommended actions include setting standards for improving DER interconnection data sharing, such as frequent updates on queues, timelines, and costs. Setting timelines for interconnection processes and PIMs for meeting timeline standards, establishing an ombudsperson role to assist with dispute resolution, consider establishing fast track or expedited review processes for small systems, or using group studies to improve study timelines. And lastly, regulators can facilitate stakeholder groups that can share data needs and use cases and provide feedback on data sharing. So outside of utility commissions and regulatory proceedings, state agencies and other stakeholders can still participate in interconnection processes and improving DER interconnection data sharing. So they can do this by promoting data sharing or transparency standards and planning proceedings, encouraging data sharing that aligns with standards set in other states, and providing feedback and forums on the availability of data on DER interconnection queues, timelines, and costs. And lastly, utilities can consider sharing DER interconnection data on queues, timelines, and costs. So this is another link to the I2X Connect. Please join to participate in a discussion and exchange on DER interconnection. So with that, I will go to see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Kathryn. That was great, right on time. So there was one question early on in your presentation from Arnell. In general, what kinds of information need to be validated or verified when DERs apply to interconnect? So what is the utility verifying? What kinds of data?
Well, they're looking at the location of systems. They're looking at the capacity that's rated. They look at one-line diagrams, for instance, of the project. So at the interconnection application process, all of that information is verified. If there's missing data, they'll send it back to the customer to have them fill in that data, and then they can send back their application. Further on in the application process during the technical study, there's a lot of validation around system safety, and that takes place under the technical review.
Great. Hopefully that answered your question. Any other questions? People want to raise their hand or put something in the chat box or just take yourself off mute. I'm also going to prime folks to sort of respond. How many of you are working directly on interconnection issues, whether you're at a utility or you're at a state energy office or, public utility commission, a tribal entity, and then what specifically are you working on? So I know you have some peer sharing activities that DOE is coordinating, but I don't know if it gets this specific. What are you working on interconnection? Is anybody willing to share? This is when it gets really quiet. Ooh, we have someone. Thank you, Lisa.
We have recently implemented a new software that really has simplified our interconnection process. At Holy Cross Energy, we're a
Oh, it's a
cooperative on the
great
Western
utility.
Slope. Oh, thank you. We ask for a lot of details, and it is being so detailed that we want to know exactly what you're building, and we have a lot of requirements into how that you do build it and connect it for interconnection and grid reliability. We really struggled to find a process that gathered all the information, that communicated with our members and the solar installers, which is our biggest interconnection for solar and storage. We found an amazing software that we really like, and really had the ability to custom build it to specifically our needs.
So this is the third-party software?
Third-party software, it's called Power Clerk. And it really, really made a difference.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing. We have a report you might be interested in coming up that Grace is leading on automation, and she'll talk a little bit about that next. Emily, thank you for volunteering. What are you working on? Or do you have a question?
Kind of, I guess, a mix of both.
That's great.
Excuse me. Sorry. So I actually have extremely little experience with interconnection, so that's not a very, I guess, helpful to the conversation. But I wanted to interject just because I really appreciate your time talking about this or any general subject that I don't have experience in, but especially interconnection. So could anyone, Kathryn or anybody else, tell me, I guess, what got you into interconnection work, and was there a motivation? Is there a general purpose? Just really, what do you feel is your general experience coming into working in interconnection, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I was thrilled with the opportunity to work on this at Berkeley Lab, because I had prior experience working in industry, and even on a research basis of interconnection being a major barrier to deployment and kind of one of the biggest pain points for developers, both in terms of backlog of queues and high costs, higher increasing costs. And there's just so much to solve there. It's a really wicked problem. And I think what really was exciting to work on this project specifically is that if we don't have the data, we can't really illuminate the problem, nor can we find solutions to it. And so that's what's great about this I2X DER interconnection work, is because it's really promoting the sharing of data and increasing data transparency, which we need to be able to understand the problem and know where we're at and measure progress towards achieving that, so that we can meet the energy demands of the future.
Grace, you want to add anything?
Yeah, for sure. So, Emily, I worked at the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, and Hawaii is just such an interesting landscape with regards to DERs. Half of the homes in Hawaii have solar on them, and about 98% of all new solar is coming online with batteries. And it makes up a huge portion of our capacity here. Like, it actually is serving about a third of the energy in Hawaii. So that's just like off the bat, we got to make good use of that solar and battery resource that we have. And if you're not able to get it interconnected to the grid, you can't make good use of it. So we worked a lot here on being an island system. We were shutting down a coal plant based on a legislative mandate. And we wanted to replace that with solar resources, but they were all delayed because of the pandemic. And so we actually stood up like a virtual power plant program very quickly. And we needed to figure out how to get those resources online really quickly in order to actually serve capacity in a meaningful way. So it was a really challenging time for the state, but really I learned a ton about interconnection and how important it is to be able to maintain grid stability in like high penetration of DERs and getting things online quickly to help serve resources and just being really thoughtful about making good use of the resources that you have on your system. So it's I also sort of agree with Kathryn. It's a wicked problem where there's like so many different aspects of it. There's engineering, there's policy, there's human aspects. It's just really like a fun challenge to tackle.
Well, thanks for that, Grace. And Arnell asks, hey, what is your background like a photo background or oh, this is for Kathryn. Okay, so sorry, Kathryn. A question about your background. They want to know if your office has this great a view.
Yes, indeed. This is the view from the top of Building 90, so I'm told, Berkeley Lab. It has a beautiful view of the San Francisco Bay.
What do you mean, so you're told? You work there?
Well, I work there. You can see this from the top, but I'm like, is it actually Building 90 that they took the photo? I
Oh,
believe
that's the question.
so.
Yeah, we actually have a pretty good view out of Building 90 in some places. All right, one more serious question about this is a really good one. So we're talking today about like generation and storage interconnection, but there's a lot of there are a lot of issues today around large load interconnection, right? And meeting the generation needs and delivery. You know, not only do you need generation, but you gotta be able to deliver it. It's usually at the transmission level, but we are seeing some. There's certainly data centers at the distribution level and some expansions. So the question is, have there been any notable trends you've seen regarding interconnection from large loads, such as data centers? They initially might bring in their own power or part of it, and then plan to interconnect or interconnect it, at a greater capacity level in the future. And the one thing I'll note is that we're working on a paper on that right now. Natalie Mims-Frick and Fritz Karl. So look for that report, I think somewhat pretty soon. But I think this is a good moment to mention flexible interconnection. And I don't know, Grace, I can't recall if you're going to talk more about it later. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I have a couple slides on flexible interconnection, but in general, the idea is that you can design a DER system in such a way that you can either kind of limit its power output or control it so that you're avoiding creating grid constraints. And there are a number of ways that you can do this or like think about it strategically to help avoid or delay needing to invest in grid upgrades to accommodate a DER system. Some folks I've heard use the term sort of a bridge to wires. So you're interconnecting in a more limited fashion. Maybe you've reduced your power output or you're willing to curtail your generation for a little bit until the utility can connect, can build infrastructure to accommodate your resource. Or it might be a more permanent situation where, the utility is asking you to curtail 2% of the time every year, and that reduces your interconnection costs significantly. And that might be a worthwhile trade-off to you. Like you're avoiding potentially millions of dollars in interconnection costs and, kind of having limited curtailment. That's a little more DER specific than for like large loads. I don't know. Is there anything else you wanted me to cover there, Lisa?
No, I think it's a good transition to your presentation. And then
Great.
folks should feel free to keep putting their questions in the chat, raising your hand, and we'll have time, a little bit more time for Q&A at the end. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining and for being part of this discussion. I'm excited to dive into some of the DER interconnection roadmaps solutions here. So here's what I'm going to cover. I'm going to focus on a couple of the more specific high impact solutions presented in DOE's interconnection roadmap. we'll talk through some examples and close with ways that you can support these interconnection improvements at your organizations. There's a lot of information in these slides, so hopefully you'll come back to them and continue to reach out after this conversation for questions and support from the lab team. Okay, so the first topic I want to go through is strategic use of automation. In the DER interconnection roadmap, goal 1 is focused on data access, transparency, and security. And as we just heard from Kathryn, this is really foundational to improving your interconnection process and to setting up other solutions in the roadmap. And you as stakeholders and in your organizations play a really important role in helping to identify and collect and provide the most impactful data needed. As part of this goal, the roadmap identifies strategic use of automation as a solution. And we're currently working on research on automating DER interconnection. So I'm going to present some initial findings and thoughts on this. And as Kathryn mentioned at the beginning, there are some targets in the roadmap that really set ambitious timelines for how we want to be able to meet interconnection. So we want to be able to take small resources and interconnect them within one day. Automation can be a really helpful tool for doing that. But what do we mean by automation? In the simplest terms, automation refers to having technology perform work that a human was doing, or maybe that humans have not even been able to do. For interconnection, there are 2 major tasks for technology, or kind of types of tasks. First is managing information, so collecting and organizing information and data, and then processing that, so actually parsing through the data to understand it and ultimately use it to make decisions. Automation is really not a 0 or 100% kind of a thing. Often something is partly automated, or there are degrees of automation like those shown here on this slide. In the DER interconnection world, there's a lot of opportunity to automate various aspects of the interconnection process. When utilities start to get really inundated with DER applications, they frequently feel like humans simply cannot keep up, especially when there are strict regulatory deadlines that they have to meet. So they'll turn to automation in some way to help them process those applications. But to make that automation work, it needs to, 1, be technically reliable, 2, be worth the costs of implementing it, 3, have humans who are actually willing to use it, and 4, be within the bounds of the utilities and the regulatory environment and cybersecurity requirements there. Technically, we found that there are automations for every step in the interconnection process, but it kind of varies with how well they are working and how prevalent they are being adopted by utilities right now. In reality, automation is most commonly being deployed for things like communications management, workflow processing, and really for like smaller residential scale systems that are less likely to cause issues on the grid. Additionally, in order to make automation work, you have to have a good foundation, meaning 1, you need good data in place, high quality data, and 2, you really need to make sure that your interconnection process itself is pretty well dialed in, pretty streamlined. Otherwise, you're going to be automating something that's not optimized. You might be spending more money than you need to automating a non-optimal process. In our research so far, we found that utilities are pursuing automation because they're facing 1 or more of these challenges or needs. So 1, big volumes of applications and long backlogs. 2, wanting to streamline their work processes and reduce their interconnection timelines. This is often in response to regulatory deadlines in the interconnection tariff, or again, those kind of big volumes that they need to meet. 3 is unhappy customers or wanting to improve the customer experience. Customers really don't want to wait forever to have their application reviewed, or they don't want to send their application off into a black box and get no information about what's happening with it. So automation tools can help to communicate effectively with customers move things along more quickly, and really just keep those customers more apprised of their application status. Automation can also help reduce human error and potentially lead to better grid reliability. And finally, we heard a lot about staffing issues at utilities. We heard from multiple folks that staff assigned to process interconnection applications were often having to work super long hours and work overtime in order to keep up. That overtime can be very costly for utilities, so being able to reduce human time on tasks is really helpful. We found that and reviewed about 60 plus different software tools that serve some sort of automation task for interconnection. There's a lot of overlap in what these tools do, but in general, we categorized things into kind of these three types of buckets of software. The first is processing type software applications. These handle things that are more administrative or workflow oriented, like collecting signatures, moving an application from one staff member to another at the utility, or taking in application information. Lisa mentioned Power Clerk. That's a very common tool that we're seeing utilities adopt, especially for this process type automation there. Then there are more technical tools that take on review of grid impacts of DER systems. So those are more doing engineering and screening type reviews. And finally, there are kind of related process tools or other tools that help to enhance your automation and integrate with other aspects of the interconnection process. There are a lot of options to choose from. And I think it's pretty interesting that these tools are really getting more sophisticated over time. The software industry is always improving, and these tools are really gonna get better over time. There are many benefits of automation, many of which are correlated with those drivers that we talked about. So automation can reduce processing times and cost to interconnect, can reduce human effort needed, and improve both customer and employee satisfaction. When you get into those more sophisticated software tools, you can also start seeing more benefits that are kind of more technical, like better grid forecasting. You can play out different interconnection scenarios as well. And you might even be able to use less conservative planning assumptions, which can help you interconnect more resources without having to invest in grid upgrades. Lots of benefits here. And this has played out at multiple utilities. This is just a few kind of case studies on how automation has affected different utilities' times and costs to interconnect. Pacific Gas and Electric in California was seeing huge net metering applications back in the mid 2014, 2015, those kinds of timelines. With implementation of automation, they reduced their cost to process those applications by almost 70%. They were able to process applications in just 3 days, even as those application volumes were getting higher. And they saved almost $30 million, recouping their investment 16-fold. So that's pretty intense and successful investment. Similarly, in Con Ed, even more recently, they reduced their processing time to just 2 days. And they're having almost 80% of applications within a specific level of review passing with absolutely no manual review. Alliant Energy in Wisconsin, I think, is also an interesting case here. They put a lot of focus on streamlining their process up front. So they reduced or consolidated what they're requesting from customers by 35%. Customers do not have to fill out 450 different data fields that they used to have to fill out. And they were able to really streamline their process across multiple states that they work in and really improve that customer experience. There are challenges to automation, so I don't want you to just think this is like a silver bullet. First of all, you need to have robust and accurate data sets. A lot of times we hear that utility GIS systems can be challenging. They might have missing or incorrect data. And there might be challenges to actually modeling the utilities distribution system as well that can pose challenges to certain kinds of automation. There is also a challenge of integrating automations with different types of tools. So, if another department at the utility is using a different software tool, it can be challenging to integrate that, or even working externally with partners like permitting agencies or authorities having jurisdiction that are involved in the interconnection process. That can be a challenge. In a lot of cases, utilities might not be seeing high volumes of applications and are able to keep up with those application reviews and aren't really feeling like there would be a good benefit to investing financially, like the payoff would not be as good for them. So that can be a challenge sometimes. And then some utilities we heard have challenges with the interconnection rules themselves. Maybe they're hard to read in a machine. They might have free-form applications that are harder to process through automation. Or they might be working across different jurisdictions where they have to actually automate to different kinds of interconnection requirements. We also heard that it can be a challenge to automate, to get utility or commission approval for changes that they need to make to the interconnection process in order to automate it. And a really big one that we heard is that utilities are very cyber secure. They're very aware of cybersecurity risks, and introducing new software can potentially cause new cybersecurity risks. So those are some challenges associated with this. As I mentioned, those software companies really are always trying to push the envelope on what their software can do, keep up with the newest technology, and a lot of them are trying to incorporate AI or machine learning in some way to help enhance their automations or meet different needs that utilities have. We've heard that they can improve forecasting, do long-range scenario analysis. They can help to proactively identify grid issues that might come up, and even address things like free-form questions by using like large language models to review free-form information that's coming in from utility applications, or even assess policy changes. We heard a lot that trust is a really important piece of automation. And so I think it's going to take a while for utilities and stakeholders in general to develop trust in these tools. Ultimately, the utility is responsible for keeping the grid safe. But if that can happen, it could be pretty transformative. And so I want to ask a question to you all about this. What do you think? Do you think artificial intelligence will radically change the DER interconnection process? And your options here are yes, no, might change it a little bit, or I'm not sure. Okay, seeing some answers come in. Most folks saying that it will radically change the DER interconnection process. I'm curious if anyone wants to come off mute and share your thoughts on how it might transform it, or what you're thinking here. Me, I think we've seen some interesting case studies out there already where AI can help support more sophisticated grid engineering reviews, which is a really big investment from utilities. That's a significant investment in engineering. And so I think AI could actually radically change the DER interconnection process and potentially even avoid having humans review some types of applications altogether. Okay. See, I'll share the results so you all can see them. Most folks said yes, a couple saying it'll change it a little bit. But I guess time will tell. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about was timeline requirements and workforce development. These are a couple of foundational solutions that really help to kind of enable other aspects of interconnection improvement. These are under goal 2 of the roadmap, focused on improving the interconnection process and shortening timelines. Kathryn touched on this a little bit, but one pretty straightforward way to manage timelines is by establishing requirements for maximum time to complete each step in the interconnection process. In many cases, these deadlines are already set out in rules, but in my experience in Hawaii and in other jurisdictions, I think it's really important to periodically review the tariff and make sure that the tariff and the timelines that are set out are actually keeping up with how the utility is implementing the interconnection process, improvements in technology, and really looking for areas where you could consolidate or reduce steps or kind of reduce those timelines overall. This image is Con Ed in New York. Their queue data, which shows in the circled areas how long each step should take per the interconnection tariff, and then how long it's actually taking. In order to really set these timelines effectively, it's important to understand what the steps in the interconnection process are, which ones are taking a long time, and why. And then you can really dial in on where there's room for improvement. A lot of this work would not be possible without a skilled workforce in place. So interconnection requires a number of different areas of expertise, from engineering, technical grid engineers, to regulatory and policy experts, software engineers, those kinds of things. It really requires a diverse skill set. So ways that utilities, stakeholders, commissions can help to improve that workforce is by seeking out workforce education, making sure that this topic is front of mind and assessing what workforce needs there are out there, and then conducting targeted outreach to recruit skilled workers for interconnection related jobs and retention as well. Okay, let's get into interconnection studies and cost allocation. These are under goal 3, promoting economic efficiency in interconnection. Kathryn covered a bit about interconnection studies, but just to go over this again, so I've got an image here of the IREC model interconnection procedures. Those are a really great resource for understanding the interconnection process and thinking about ways to improve it over time. So there are different types of screens and studies depending on the size of the system and how much impact it might have on the grid. For smaller systems, you can use simplified or fast track screens. These are for systems that are unlikely to have adverse grid impacts. And you look at a limited set of analyses to figure out whether or not they will have impacts on the grid. If they fail those, or the utility determines that additional study is needed, then they can do a supplemental review, which would look at why the system failed those screens. For larger scale systems, utilities often do a system impact study, which is a more detailed analysis of power load flow and different types of grid engineering impacts that might happen. And based on those results, then the utility would conduct a facility study, which identifies what type of equipment is needed to actually meet those needs. And then based on all these findings, the utility identifies whether they might need new equipment or whether they can use smart inverter settings or different management techniques to reduce those issues on the grid. This is an image showing kind of how the process and the study process differs by size. And this will vary based on your jurisdiction's tariff and different rules here, but you can kind of see that for small systems, there are fast track and simplified review options where there are fewer review screens and the interconnection costs are more minimal. And then as you get larger and larger, you're having more review, and your costs can vary significantly, ranging from minimal to even millions of dollars for large systems. So as part of the study process, excuse me, utilities determine whether upgrades are needed to accommodate the resource. When they do that, that study or that analysis, the utility will often oversize the equipment compared to the immediate need. One, because equipment only comes in certain sizes, or because the utility might want to build in some flexibility to accommodate future resources or operational needs. Through the process of cost allocation, the cost for that equipment gets assigned to interconnection customers. Across the US right now, a majority of states are using what's called the cost causer pays model, which means that the interconnection customer that first triggers an upgrade is typically responsible for the full cost of that upgrade. The image on this is showing that distribution system costs, in part due to DER or new load interconnections, is really increasing across the US. So the cost causer pays model can be okay in some cases and might make sense in many cases, but there's also good reason to think about revisiting the cost allocation model that your state is using. As the grid becomes more constrained, interconnection costs are going to go up and become a barrier to getting more DERs on the grid. In the US DOE's interconnection roadmap, they identify cost allocation as a key strategy to improving interconnection because it can more appropriately assign costs to different customers and therefore reduce costs for certain customers and allow them to interconnect more quickly. In addition, the distribution system is requiring upgrades both to accommodate DERs and to meet other growing pressures. So with that spending going up so much, it's important that we maximize the use of that spending, do it as efficiently as possible, and think about our grid needs more holistically so that we can allocate costs effectively and ensure that we're not having to go back and redo work. So cost allocation can help be more thoughtful and reduce overall costs in the long term. In many cases, the cost causer pays model creates a free ridership problem because the interconnection customer that first interconnects is paying 100% of the upgrade costs. And then anybody who interconnects that equipment after them is able to benefit without having to pay. I'm gonna plug in my computer. Okay. So there are many different cost allocation approaches that you can think about using. We identified 6 general approaches to cost allocation shown in this slide and the next slide. The first is a fixed fee. This is all customers are charged a flat price to interconnect. The second is direct cost assignment, meaning that the full cost of something is charged to a single customer. This is the cost causer pays model, in which the customer is assigned all of the costs directly for interconnecting. Next is pro rata assignment. We're seeing a lot of states use this approach when they're maybe thinking about changes to the cost causer pays model. This approach charges customers proportionally for use of the distribution system. So, or the upgrade that has been installed. That's usually on like $1 per kilowatt or $1 per megawatt basis. Another approach would be to use established rate case allocators. So basically rate basing your costs and relying on the rate making process to determine how to allocate those costs to customers. Some emerging approaches include grid usage charges. So that would typically be $1 per kilowatt hour price, so more energy than capacity related, charged on customer bills. And finally, locational pricing, which charges customers based on the availability of hosting capacity in a certain location. In order to implement any of these cost allocation approaches, regulators and stakeholders also need to consider other components and questions like how was the need identified? Was it triggered from a single interconnection request or a group? Who is benefiting from the upgrades, et cetera? And so putting these together, we come up with what we call a cost allocation and recovery framework. There are multiple different options that utilities and states are are using right now. One is cost causer pays. We talked about that. The next is reimbursing the initial customer over time. So somebody might pay for the upgrade, and then if additional customers interconnect after that, they might pay them back. You could also create a reserve fund, so you can collect fees, like standard fees from all customers, and use that to fund upgrades. You can do group interconnection studies and charge each of the customers in a group proportionally based on their use of the equipment. You can do reactive cost sharing, where if a grid upgrade need is triggered, then you establish a period of time in which customers can choose to interconnect and pay a share of their use of the interconnection equipment. A similar approach to that is proactive grid upgrades, meaning that you forecast out where you expect upgrades to be needed and then have customers pay when they interconnect. Often you're reimbursing ratepayers there. Can also establish cost caps or a maximum cost responsibility and recover anything above that from ratepayers. You can incorporate grid usage costs into tariffs, so kind of charge customers on an ongoing basis over time for their interconnection costs. You can also follow line extension cost allocation practices, which is similar to kind of a typical approach for charging for line extensions, where the utility covers a portion of the costs and get under an allowance. And then finally, you can do scarcity pricing, which is that locational based pricing. Just a couple of examples for you here. So this is Minnesota's small DER cost sharing fund. This is an example of a reserve fund and cost caps. So this has been in place since 2023 to support distribution upgrades for small DERs that are 40 kilowatts or less. All customers under that umbrella pay a flat fee, and then any upgrade costs under $15,000 are covered by that fund until the fund is depleted. The average cost for a distribution system upgrade would have been about $9,000 per application if paid only by the relevant applications that caused those needs. But instead, each of nearly 10,000 customers paid only $200 per system. So this kind of is a more fair way to share costs in some views. Massachusetts is really out on the leading edge of some of these issues and has adopted provisional reforms to cost allocation for interconnection. They adopted this provisional program that allows utilities to rate base certain interconnection costs and then be reimbursed over time by customers who interconnect. Ultimately, the costs are shared between ratepayers and interconnection customers based on how much each benefits. The images on the bottom here show Eversource's capital investment project information. The projects are shown on the left, and then on the right is how they're calculating the fee for that Marion Fairhaven group. You can see they've calculated that a certain amount of benefit is going to ratepayers and a certain amount of benefit is going to interconnection customers. And then those interconnection customers pay back ratepayers over 20 years. In Australia, they've had really strong DER uptake. And so stakeholders requested changes to create a regulatory framework that better supports DER interconnection and integration. They specifically called out the need for utility distributors services to support customer exports and allow or require utility customers that have DERs to pay for their share of the required infrastructure. In order to do this, they established what they call export tariffs. These are ongoing charges on customer bills to pay for the cost of exporting energy from DERs to the utilities distribution grid, shown in this table here. So it's really like a way to build in the cost to export energy into customer bills. Okay, so quick poll here. Has your jurisdiction implemented any cost allocation methodologies other than cost causer pays? Yes, no, but we're thinking about it, or unsure. Okay, one person says yes. Another person is thinking about it. Most folks unsure here. If you are, if your jurisdiction has implemented a change, I would love if you'd put that in the chat and let us know kind of what you've all been working on. Be great. Maybe I'll just give 10 more seconds. If anybody else wants to input answers. Okay, last chance. I'm going to end the poll and share results. This really resonates with me that a lot of folks are unsure here. I think if you haven't come upon challenges for grid costs that require you to think about cost allocation, you might just be happy with the status quo and not have thought about this. So that really resonates with me. Thank you all for participating. Okay, just a couple more things to share with you here. I'm going to talk about interconnection standards and flexible interconnection. So interconnection standards are really the rules of the road for how DERs can connect to the grid. This standard that is used across the industry has evolved over time. The latest standard being what we call IEEE 1547-2018. It's kind of a mouthful, but it focuses on how inverters can provide grid service functions like voltage and frequency support and have communications functionality with the utility. This is really important for having visibility into what DERs are doing and to minimizing possible negative grid impacts. And then you can maximize the value of these resources on the system too. On the bottom there, you can see UL, or explained at the top as well, but UL 1741 is a standard then that tests and certifies hardware products to ensure that they're meeting the IEEE requirements. This took me a long time to kind of parse out how this is all working together, but it is important. If you also, like me, need help understanding, IREC put out a really nice paper on the 1547 standard, and it notes that having these DER standards clearly defined really helps to increase interconnection efficiency, minimize confusion, and reduce costs overall. When you do have those more advanced standards in place, you can help to promote more advanced solutions like flexible interconnection. This uses DER controls or settings so that you're not triggering the need for grid upgrades with the DER. For example, static flexible interconnection sets those parameters when the DER interconnects, whereas dynamic flexible interconnection is more real-time management of the DER based on actual grid conditions. This is a really interesting solution because it can help move the queue along before the utility is able to construct or needs to construct new equipment. However, there are also challenges and drawbacks to flexible interconnection. Both of these approaches, static and dynamic, rely on more granular grid data to determine how much room there is on the grid for a DER, and in order to understand when you might need to modify the DER's performance so that you're able to avoid those upgrades. Both also require the use of hardware and software that the utility feels good about relying on to perform as it says it will. For dynamic flexible interconnection in particular, this can be a pretty complex approach. And so you have to be willing to invest in communication and control equipment. All right, just to wrap up here, this was a deep dive into a couple of the solutions, but there are a ton of solutions in the roadmap that are complementary or some that stand alone, but I encourage you to take a look at those solutions and consider how you might be able to apply them in your jurisdiction. A couple of ones that I didn't touch on that I think are really important is one, improving hosting capacity, understanding what your grid can and cannot accommodate. Coordinating your approaches with grid planning is really important to get a holistic picture of what your grid will need down the road. And then adopting recent standards and more emerging approaches like those flexible interconnection and proactive planning approaches. Here are some example actions that you can take. So as regulators, you can often drive the bus here. You can consider adopting new standards, require the utility to meet certain deadlines, or facilitate other updates to the interconnection rules and tariffs in order to incorporate new technologies like automation, and think about new cost allocation approaches. Other state agencies and stakeholders play a really important role here too, thinking about what are appropriate interconnection timelines, what data do we actually need from the utility in order to assess new automation techniques or cost allocation approaches, or can we push the utility or encourage them to pursue new pilots and emerging approaches? Utilities, of course, play an important role here as the entities that are actually doing interconnection. They have a key role in providing high quality data and then working with stakeholders to pursue new approaches and think outside the box here. Oh, as Kathryn said, I do encourage you to join our I2X Connect group. If you go to that link right now, you can request a profile, and you'll see all of our research coming out there. There are discussion forums, so if you have questions, you can pose those in that forum. And here's a list of additional resources for you in case you are interested in any of these topics and would like to dig in deeper. We've got a lot coming your way too, so definitely do stay in touch. I do see some chats coming through, so I would love to turn to discussion now.
Great, thank you, Grace. I wanted to ask you first, while people are thinking about their questions. What's your favorite cost allocation method? You've been thinking about this for a while. From what we have today, cost causer pays, which does not necessarily mean that all beneficiaries pay. And then you've done research across the country and looked at Australia's emerging method.
Ooh, that's such a good question. I think there are a lot of benefits and drawbacks to each approach. I don't know that any one of them is a silver bullet or particularly solving every challenge with interconnection cost allocation. I personally like Australia's export tariff approach. I think they've been really thoughtful there in thinking about treating DERs in the same manner as load resources. And so to me, that is a good way for the utility to be able to collect revenue on an ongoing basis, to be able to invest in what upgrades they need to accommodate those resources so customers aren't limited in how they can use and which DERs they can adopt. And it also reduces that really high upfront cost for customers to interconnect because they're paying over time, which is more like what we do when we pay for consuming energy. I also think the proactive approaches are really smart. Looking at your grid and where you think you're going to need upgrades in the future, whether it's for a DER or for a load, I think is really smart because you can get ahead of the problem and make sure that customers don't have to wait for you to construct that equipment. There is some risk associated with that because, of course, forecasts are uncertain and we don't know exactly where things will show up. But I think it's really smart to be able to invest now for what we think we'll need and we're confident we'll need in the future. So lots of different options that jurisdictions can use based on what their priorities are and what the challenges they're seeing are on the grid.
I just put a link in the chat to a report that was published a year ago that was sort of gets into some of the foundational issues that kind of can support an import-export tariff like Grace just talked about. And Grace's report will be out, we hope, soon, next couple of months. We hope. Any other questions? People want to take themselves off mute, raise their hand, put something in the chat box. There was one comment from Emily that I thought was about how I feel about it, about going back to automation. AI is one of those things that's like just very unpredictable. There's a lot of volatility. It's hard to know like whether changes will be radical. So it made it hard to respond to that that poll I think that you had. What are you finding in terms of like you've done a lot of interviews with utilities and regulators and software developers and others. What are they sort of saying about how far they think AI is going to take them and in what time frame?
There are extremely mixed opinions, I think. Some people say AI and software and automation are going to be able to do every aspect of interconnection in the next 5 years, and humans aren't going to have to touch interconnection even for large scale resources. It's going to get that sophisticated. Other folks are saying, no way. We need an engineer's eyes on these projects to make sure that the grid is going to stay safe. And they don't believe that AI will be able to process kind of those more free-form information, or really be able to reliably review information in a way that they trust. So to me, the kind of key aspect here is the human element of things. I think in places where you see the staff at the utility are willing to kind of trust and go on a limb to try new things, I think you're seeing a little bit more forward thinking there. On the other side, where people are more used to how they're doing it, they feel very confident that their engineers are able to review things effectively. I think they're maybe a little more hesitant to adopt those kinds of automations.
All right, we have 4 minutes and two quick questions, not that are not really that quick. There's a DERMS, DER management system. PPL has. Have you? I don't know that you've have any experience with that.
This, I think it's in Pennsylvania, the utility is trying to own maybe front of the meter DER assets and use them to manage the system, or they're investing in DERMS and able to do that. I'm not very familiar with that topic, but I will say I think DERMS is a very challenging topic for utilities, for regulators, for stakeholders, because there are a lot of different options out there. And it's kind of hard to know what will be interoperable with a bunch of different kinds of systems, what you actually need in order to effectively manage DERs, and what kind of value that will provide to the utility. I know we struggled with this a lot in Hawaii, where the utility was saying they needed to invest in 4 different types of communication infrastructure in order to meet communication needs from different types of DERs and manufacturers. So it's a really challenging topic, and it's not cheap. And so it is an important thing to dig into to be able to get value from your DERs by providing grid services.
Like when it's needed, is in the eyes of the beholder. And so utilities got to make the case, right? That now is the time needed, not later. And that can be a kind of hard case to make. It may not be difficult in Hawaii when you have really high DER penetration levels and you're counting on those DERs as capacity resources with storage. But in other places, it might be harder. Okay, one last question, quick feedback. Following up about, your points about the mixed messages you were hearing about AI. What was their rationale for it's going to solve everything. Everything's going to be done by automation, or, we still need an engineer's eyeballs. Is it based on data, or is it just more like, their own take a whack at it and kind of answer?
Great question. There is evidence out there, I think, that points to how AI and automation can be used to support each aspect of the interconnection process. But it's emerging. And so it kind of depends, in my view, on whether the person we spoke to or the utility has kind of explored those types of options. So for example, PowerClerk is piloting the use of large language models to review single line diagrams. And that was a pretty controversial point, where some folks had been familiar with the use of PowerClerk and were participating in these pilots, of reviewing single line diagrams. And we're saying like, well, it might be possible in the future. We're still kind of working out some kinks, but it's actually coming down the pipe and we can see it. Whereas other folks were saying, you know, we haven't seen any technology that is actually able to review single line diagrams effectively. So there's sort of this dichotomy of like how familiar you are with the different technology solutions out there. And then again, just sort of like comfort level with using that.
All right,
It's
we're gonna have to leave it there. We're at time. Thanks everyone for staying with us. And feel free to reach out to any of us, Kathryn, Grace, or me. If you have any follow-up questions, be happy to help you point you in the right direction. All right, thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Just super quick, if we wanted to reach out further for contact, how should we do that? Just go through the slides and the contacts there on the
Yeah.
link.
Just our email addresses are in the back slide, and we always welcome you to get in touch with us. It's sometimes the fastest way to get an answer to a question.
All right, awesome. Thank you
All
so
right,
much all
thanks,
for your
everyone.
time.
Nice to see you again.
Bye, thank you.
Nice to see you. Take care.